Alright, in this video I'm going to introduce the idea of total float or total slack. They're exactly the same thing. Float and slack is interchangeable, just some people use the word float, some people use the word slack. I'll personally probably be using the word float just out of habit, but if you either hear slack or float, they're exactly the same thing. And also we're going to learn how to calculate it in a network diagram in this video. So first of all, let's draw up the network diagram for this video. You already know how to do this. It looks like this, where right off the bat you can do the forward pass to calculate ES and EF, which is the early start and the early finish. And then you can do the backwards pass to calculate the late start and the late finish. Now, total float, also called total slack, is the amount of time that you could delay any given activity without delaying the project end date. So there's two ways that we can calculate this. We can take the difference between the late finish and the early finish, or we can take the difference between the late start and the early start, just like this. So either of these we can use to calculate the total float. If we take the difference between the late finish and the early finish, we call that the finish float. If we take the difference between the late start and the early start, we call that the start float. They're exactly the same thing and they both stand for total float. Now any activity that has a total float of 0 will form the critical path. So the way that we're going to draw this on the network diagram is I will be writing the total float above each box just like this. So we'll go through here. Activity A, 5 minus 5 is 0. 0 minus 0, that would also give us 0. So its total float is equal to 0. You know what, we can actually even just write for now, total float equals 0. So here we have 6 minus 5 is 1, and we also could have found that by doing 9 minus 8 is 1. So activity B's total float is 1. Activity C, you can see its total float would be 0, because 5 minus 5 is 0, same with 9 minus 9. Total float is equal to 0. Here we have 9 minus 9 or 11 minus 11, so we get the total float is equal to 0. And same for the last one, total float is equal to 0. So this will give us a critical path here that I've outlined in red. So the critical path would be A, C, D, E. So the critical path is formed by all of the activities that have a total float of 0. But what this really means is if you were to delay any of these activities on the critical path, by any amount of days, let's say by 1 day, then the project duration would increase by the same amount of time, by a day. For example, if we look at activity D here, it's on the critical path. If we take 1 extra day to do it, it would finish on day 12. Then we'd have to bring this 12 to activity E because activity E can't start until D is done. And then it would be 12 plus 3, and we would be getting that the project end date would be on the 15th day, not the 14th day. However, if we delay an activity that's not on the critical path, so an activity that doesn't have a float of 0, it won't affect the end date of the project as long as we don't surpass the total float. Now, what that means is activity B here has a total float of 1. That means we can delay activity B by 1 day without affecting the end date of the project. And you can see that by looking here. So activity B, the earliest start should be on day 5. Now if we actually started this on day 6, then we would finish on day 9, and then if we go to bring in this 9 here, it's not going to push back the start date of D because the D already started on 9 because of activity C. And also that brings up another good point where when we look at the late start and the late finish, those late start was the latest an activity can start without affecting the end date of the whole project. So with that said, you see that this total float is 1. So if we had 5 plus 1, that gives us the 6 right here. So that's just saying, but without even knowing what floats were before this point, we could have just looked here and said, well, yeah, we can delay it by 1 day without delaying the end date of the project.